Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. We come now in our ongoing series, The Bible in 5 Minutes. Having spent significantly more than 5 minutes on the Bible, we give 5 minutes or maybe 6.5 to each of the books of the Bible. We've now reached our way to the book of James. Last week, if you were tuned in, we looked at the book of Hebrews, and I mentioned that Hebrews is my favorite book in the Bible, and part of the reason for that is how it combines together elements from the Old Testament with things in the New Testament. Well, the same thing is true for the book of James. In fact, there are some scholars who describe the book of James as a form of New Testament wisdom literature. That is, it's sort of like the Psalms or the Proverbs. There's a deep, deep practicality in the book of James. Now, the book is almost certainly written by that James who was the brother of Jesus. There are a number of Jameses that we're introduced to in various places in the New Testament, including the son of Zebedee, the twin. But this James is almost certainly James who was the brother of Jesus, was not a believer for the bulk of Jesus' earthly ministry, perhaps until the resurrection, but who became the leader of the Jerusalem church. He presided over the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. Many scholars believe that James was actually the first of the New Testament books that was ever to be written. And that may very well be the case. What's going on in the book? Well, James is giving counsel to probably to Jewish Christians who are not living there near Jerusalem or in Judea on how to and on the need to live out their faith. There's a lot of controversy about how James and Paul work together. That James says that we're not justified by faith alone, and Paul says we are justified by faith alone. And we've covered that in the past. I'll give you a quick version of that answer. The simple truth is that Paul is talking about that which makes us justified, or that which brings us to that which makes us justified. That is, that our faith appropriates the work of Christ, and it is the work of Christ on our behalf, our resting in that alone, and that work of Christ that justifies us. What James is answering is the question of how do we justify our belief that we are justified? What's the evidence of the belief? And there the answer is in part through our works. That if you say you have faith, that you rest and trust in the finished work of Christ, but you don't grow in grace, you don't mature, you don't over time begin to reflect more the character of Christ, then you probably don't have saving faith. That's a big part of James' message, but also, again, a lot of specifics about what those sort of walking out the faith issues really are. One of my favorite things about the book of James is that it actually inspired one of my books. The book is called Believing God. The subtitle is 12 Biblical Promises that Christians struggle to believe. And it really grew out of James' promise on the issue of wisdom. James says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask the Father who gives to all liberally without finding fault. And I remember having a hunger for wisdom, coming across this verse and thinking, my stars, this sounds like the only thing you need to do to get wisdom is to ask. And because I lacked wisdom, I thought, well, that can't be true. That sounds far too easy. And went and tried to finagle out of the plain, what's the word for it? The plain lavishness of the promise. And eventually came back and said, if you actually go back and look at the original Greek and break down these words in this sentence and do a careful word study, what you find out is that what James is saying is that if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask the Father who gives to all liberally without finding fault. And I thought, my stars, how often have I done this with other texts, places where God makes a promise and I don't believe it? So that's where believing God came from and was inspired by this particular text. Now, James's audience, they're probably going through, well, they're certainly going through some level of suffering and persecution. They're living in poverty. They're socially ostracized. And James is zealous to encourage them to keep the faith, to keep walking, to know that hardships that God puts us through are for our good and for our maturing. He is eager to remind us of future judgment that is coming. So it's just one of the ways it's kind of like these wisdom literature. I think I've mentioned this before. When you go through the Proverbs, have you ever felt like, how in the world did whoever put these chapters together figure out how to do this with Proverbs? Because every proverb just looks like a bucket full of aphorisms, a bucket full of individual wise sayings that don't really have a lot of relationship with each other. Well, you can feel similarly as James says, well, do this and watch out for that and be careful here. But at the end of the day, what he's asking us to do is to trust God. That's a message that we all need to hear. James was a great man of faith, a great man of prayer, a great man of wisdom, and that shows through. So there's my summary of the book of James. I hope you'll check it out. Don't be afraid of it. Luther was wrong when he said it was a right strawy epistle or doubted whether it belonged in the canon. It is God's word. Cherish it and study it. Something you may not know about me that might be a little bit of a surprise. I know how to juggle. I'm no professional. I'm not even a gifted amateur. I'm merely competent. I'm a better juggling teacher than I am a juggler. Because I learned this and learned it well. Juggling is the art of throwing something the same way over and over again. That's it. That's the secret. You take one ball, beanbag, bowling pin, chainsaw, and toss it in an arc from one hand to the other. Once you have that down, you trade hands. Once you have that down, you take two, toss one from one hand to the other, and when it is at its peak, toss the other one to the other hand. Then, add one more. Easy. You master one little motion until that one little motion can be turned into something delightful. So it is, friends, with writing. What looks utterly mystifying to the uninitiated is not in the least complicated. All you need to do is learn how to do one thing well. And then do it over and over. That one thing, speak truth from your heart. That's it. That's the secret. As a juggler, you forget your hands and you focus on the beanbags As a writer, you forget your audience and focus on what makes you, you. What speaks to you? What is most precious to you? And then, in just the same way that it makes you, speaks to you, and is most precious to you, share it. Share it like you are sharing it with yourself. Speak it as it speaks to you. This works for one simple reason. We are simple people. The message of the writer is, I know you because I know me, and we are the same. With both juggling and writing, there are flourishes that bring joy to both the performer and the audience. I can toss behind my back. I can juggle inverted. But you know what I can't do? 4. As a writer, I can throw in a little paradoxical wordplay like Chesterton. A nugget of pinching the devil's nose like Lewis. Align an array of alliterations as agilely as anyone. But you know what I can't do? Write a novel. The flourishes in either case are nice. Little badges of progress. Benchmarks of competency. But what they are not are changes in the fundamental nature of the thing in itself. Juggling is still juggling, and writing is still writing. One more important connection. I have juggled on stage. While in college at Grove City College, I appeared in our production of Carnival. I was a circus performer because I could juggle. I could juggle, however, because I spent hours juggling all by myself. I taught myself to juggle by throwing balls into the air and trying to catch them, picking up the balls when I missed, and starting over. I've written for publication, a dozen books of my own, another dozen I've contributed to, more magazine articles than a liberal arts major can count. I could write those, however, because I spent hours writing all by myself. I taught myself to write by writing poems, letters, stories, papers. And when I missed, I started over. Do you want to write? Then master this. Speaking the truth from your heart. Let the flourishes come in their own time. Get started, and may you feel the Master's pleasure. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.